Thank you, Mr. Smith, for that introduction. Yes, if I am brown this week, it is the sun and not rain and rust, as it often is. I haven't been away that long. We were in Exeter 2 weeks ago and in Birmingham last week, so travelling around the churches a little bit. But looking back, nearly 4 years ago, if you remember, Mr. Henderson organised a short trip to Israel. And 4 of us here were able to go on that trip. And we not only saw the tourist sites of Jerusalem, but also some of the places of interest around different parts of Israel, such as Jericho, the Dead Sea, Masada, and places further north, such as the Golan Heights and Megiddo. Now, after that trip, in the course of general conversation with friends, neighbours, etc., I was asked several times, have you been anywhere interesting lately? Or have you been on holiday lately? And when I've answered those questions with, well, actually this year we went to Israel, the next question invariably was, so you've been to Jerusalem then? So, yes, been to Jerusalem. And when I answered that, a few people then followed up with another question, which was sort of rhetorical, but they said, so you went on a pilgrimage then? And on each of those occasions, I said, no, not exactly. We went to Jerusalem to see the sites, to get a feel of the culture, but we went other places as well. So it was just to see the whole of Israel, to see the geography, the location of different places, everything really about the country, as much as we could do in the 9 days. But after being asked that question those few times, I thought, is the answer yes or is it no? Should I have said yes? I mean, there were some clues actually on that trip. Before we went, we were given this, a map of most of the sites we were going to see. And it's a map of Israel. And there's a map of Jerusalem at the top, and certain sites are marked on there, and it's entitled The Pilgrim's Map. Also, there was a reception held by the office of the Mayor of Jerusalem. Right at the end of the trip, in the hotel, we had a representative from the Mayor there and the local tourist office who came along to thank us for visiting Jerusalem. And we were encouraged to get others to visit their country, which I'm sure is, something they do for all these organised trips to try and generate interest, because a lot of the economy in Israel depends on tourism. But we were all given a certificate to say that we've been to Jerusalem. And this certificate says it's a pilgrim's certificate. By this attestation be it known that Stephen Cornish, by virtue of fulfilling the biblical calling, has ascended to Jerusalem, the holy city, capital of Israel, and is henceforth authorised to bear the title of Jerusalem Pilgrim. So, I go back to my first question. Should I have answered yes to have been on a pilgrimage, or no? Well, I thought I'd better give it a little bit more consideration so that I'd be prepared for the next time I was asked. After all, some religions do emphasise the importance of going on either a walking pilgrimage or a pilgrimage to a special site. So does God want us to go on a pilgrimage? Aren't pilgrimages and pilgrims mentioned in the Bible? One of the earliest recorded pilgrimages was the journey from Egypt to the Promised Land by the children of Israel. Let's just look at that to just get that verse in our minds. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 4. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 4. And God here is speaking to Moses. And breaking into the context, he says, I have also established my covenant with them, to give them the land of Canaan, the land of their pilgrimage, in which they were strangers. So there we are, that's one pilgrimage. But there have been many other journeys that have been called pilgrimages down through history, in different places all over the world. I don't know if you watched a TV series on BBC. It was first aired last autumn, but it has been repeated again earlier this year. And it was called Pilgrimage with Simon Reeve. And there were 3 episodes, and in the first episode, one of the little bits of the programme showed where he met a man. Did anyone see the series, by the way? Oh, a couple of nods, yes, a few, yes. Well, you might remember in the first episode he met a man who for the past 26 years had carried a large life-size cross around with him on his shoulder, walking around this country and various other places. Well, in fact, it was around most of the world, I think, because he'd done, I think, the longest journey is from Berlin to Moscow. And this cross weighed 55 pounds, or for the younger people in the congregation, 25 kilograms about. So a fairly substantial weight. But the only concession he made to make it comfortable was he had a couple of small wheels on the bottom. So as he was carrying it along, he was really sort of dragging it along on these wheels. But nevertheless, Simon Reeve, the presenter, carried it or dragged it for a few hundred yards and decided, yes, this guy must have a strong shoulder to do that. And as I say, the longest pilgrimage was this walk from Berlin to Moscow, which took him 3 months. I guess the only other thing you might think is, well, how did he get it around the world, a great big cross like that? It actually was sawn in half and had a hinge in it as well, but you didn't notice that in the programme. In the second episode, he met a man who'd walked all the way to Jerusalem. You could see him walking along the coast of England, and he was chatting away, and he said, oh yes, what's the longest pilgrimage you've done? Walked all the way to Jerusalem. Well, Mr. Henderson wasn't that unkind to us, and I don't think we would have had time in 9 days to even do part of that journey. But is that the sort of thing that God wants us to do? How does the dictionary define the word pilgrimage? Now, one dictionary I looked up defined it as a journey to a shrine or other sacred place, or a journey or long search made for exalted or sentimental reasons. Wasn't too sure about that, so I looked up another dictionary which I thought was a bit clearer and maybe more appropriate for us. It defined it as a journey to a holy place, a journey to a special or unusual place. Now, the series of programmes that I just referred to focused on people who had travelled to particular places considered by them of significant religious importance. The first episode concentrated on journeys to Canterbury, which was the site of the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket in 1170 AD. The second episode covered journeys across the Channel, all the way through France, ending up in Rome. And the third episode completed the series with his journey from Istanbul all the way to Jerusalem. Yeah, Jerusalem, back there, the destination that Mr. Henderson and our group visited. However, the important thing is not what other people do or what TV programmes show about pilgrimages. It's what God in the Bible says about pilgrimages. That's important to us. And you know, the first mention of a pilgrimage in the Bible is not the one I referred to in Exodus chapter 6 verse 4 of the children of Israel going to Canaan. There is an earlier pilgrimage mentioned. So if we turn back to Genesis 47, we'll look at that pilgrimage. Genesis 47 and in verse 9. And this is Jacob speaking to Pharaoh, answering a question that Pharaoh asked him. Pharaoh asked Jacob in verse 8, "How old are you?" And in verse 9, Jacob said to Pharaoh, "The days of the years of my pilgrimage are 130 years. Few and evil have been the days of the years of my life, and they have not attained to the days of the years of the life of my fathers in the days of their pilgrimages." So we see here that Jacob called his life a pilgrimage, and he referred to the lives of his ancestors as pilgrimages. The pilgrimage of life. Now that's a little bit different from what we've looked at so far. But even in that series of programs, there was the occasional reference to the link between a long walking pilgrimage and the passage through life. And in one dictionary, the secondary definition of a pilgrimage was the course of life in this earth. So Jacob was comparing the length of his pilgrimage, his life, with those of his ancestors. And if we think about it, Jacob lived 130 years. Adam lived at 930 years. That was a long pilgrimage, longer than the 40 years that the children of Israel walked in the wilderness. Seth lived 912 years. Lamech lived 770 years. Lamech's son Noah lived 950 years. And Shem lived 600 years. Abraham lived 175 years. So yes, Jacob was right. 130 years does seem short by comparison. But what about our pilgrimages? I don't think we're going to manage pilgrimages in life of that length. Ours are shorter than Jacob, but there's some similarities. They all started off in one direction, but when called by God, when we responded, we headed off in a new direction, following God's ways. That way of life, a different pilgrimage. We committed ourselves to a new way of life, a new course of life on the earth, a new journey or a pilgrimage. Now, as I mentioned before, in that programme there were several references to similarities between a long walking pilgrimage and our lives, the course of our lives. And I picked up on a few of those as we went through the programme because I thought they were quite appropriate. And that was the first one that came out at me, the fact that it is a way. So the first point I've got here of these similarities is follow the way. In the TV series, it was shown that pilgrims didn't just go any old route to get where they were going. They followed well-defined routes from wherever they started to wherever they were going. And those routes were known as pilgrims' ways. And some of these, like parts on the route from London to Canterbury, for example, are still known by that name. Now, we also follow the way. Jesus Christ said in John 14, verse 6, and we won't turn there, it's so familiar. He said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." Christ said, "I am the way." And followers of Christ in the New Testament were initially known as those who followed the way. Let's turn into the book of Acts. Acts chapter 9. Acts chapter 9. And starting in verse 1. Then Saul, still breathing threats and murder against the disciples of the Lord, went to the high priest and asked letters from him to the synagogues of Damascus, so that if he found any who were of the way, whether men or women, he might bring them bound to Jerusalem. So there we have it. The followers of Christ were following the way. And if we turn on to Acts chapter 18, we have the example or the account of Apollos. And in verse 26, so he, Apollos, began to speak boldly in the synagogue. But when Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. So we can see there is a way of life, the way that God wants us to follow when he calls us, and that is a new direction, and that is our pilgrimage. David put it in a very poetic way in Psalms, referring to the way he followed Jesus, the Lord of the Old Testament. If we turn to Psalms 119, Psalms 119 and verse 54. Psalm 119 and verse 54. We read, "Your statutes have been my songs." We know that David composed many songs praising God's statutes. "Your statutes have been my songs in the house of my pilgrimage." So we can follow David's examples in our own pilgrimages. We find these words of David later in that psalm, Psalm 119 and 105, again a very well-known verse. "Your word is a lamp to my feet and a light to my path." That path, that way. And just like a pilgrim, we follow a path, not a physical one, a spiritual one, a way of life. So that's the first point. Just like those people who decide to go on a long walking pilgrimage, they follow a specific route, a way. And we've been called by God, and we follow his way. The second point that I drew out of that series of programs is the way is narrow and confined. As I said, pilgrims didn't just go anywhere, they followed well-worn paths to their destination. But they weren't wide thoroughfares like today's roads. I can't really envisage what they look like, but you can get some idea of it if you some of the country walks we've been on. I went on one recently, and I picked up a bit of a pilgrim's way. And you start walking along quite a wide road, obviously it's tarmacked and it's been upgraded, and then the road swings off and you find yourself going over a stile following the pilgrim's way, and it's overgrown with brambles. It probably wasn't that bad, but just trying to conceive what it was like, it would be a country track. There wouldn't be, signs every time you got to a corner, but they'd be well-worn tracks going to where they were leading to. And they had to keep to that path, because if they wandered off, they would get lost. They wouldn't know where they were going, and they wouldn't reach their destination. They may never be able to reach their destination. They just wander off, follow another path, and that's it. Jesus said in Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14, again, you're probably well ahead of me thinking about it, but just to impress it on our minds as we go through this particular set of points. Matthew 7, verse 13 and 14. Christ says, "Enter by the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the way that leads to destruction, and there are many who go in by it. Because narrow is the gate and difficult," I've got in my in my translation here, but the margin has the word confined, and different translations have different words, and I'll mention that in a minute. Because difficult or confined is the way which leads to life, and there are few who find it. So we can just imagine you're just following down this track. Are we on the right track? Yes, yeah, I think so. Great, let's keep on it. Don't go wandering off, because you might never get back on it again. Other translations have slight variations. The New International Version says, "But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." Same meaning, but it definitely has that word narrow in there, giving that concept you just can't go anywhere, restricted. International Standard Version, "How narrow is the gate, and how constricted is the road that leads to life, and there aren't many people who find it." And the King James Version, which we're probably all familiar with, "Because straight is the gate and narrow is the way." And whenever I read that translation, I think straight, it's an unusual word nowadays, isn't it? S-T-R-A-I-T. We don't often use it in normal conversation, but it's still used in the maritime terminology. You have straits, which are narrow, constricted passageways, sea channels. And often when you go through a sea channel like that, if it's really constrained, you need a pilot on board to guide you so you don't get shipwrecked. And you can think, well, yes, we do need help at times when we get to a real constricted, narrow part of our life, which is getting difficult, confined. We need a pilot, don't we? And we've got Jesus Christ to call on, and God to guide us through. So I quite like the King James Version from that point of view, because it always brings that to mind. But we can do this. How can we follow that path? How can we just keep on that path? We can do that if we follow the advice in Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3. Proverbs chapter 3 and in verse 5. "Trust in the Lord with all your heart, and lean not on your own understanding." So it's not a case of going down this path thinking, I think I know a shortcut. I think I just pop off here and come back on later on. Talking physically, spiritually, obviously you don't wander away from God's ways. "Lean not on your own understanding." Verse 6, "In all your ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct your paths." And the direct there is, I've got a footnote which says it'll smooth out or straighten. If we just turn over one chapter while we're in Proverbs, Proverbs chapter 4 and verse 25. Another good piece of advice when either following a narrow path down a country lane or our passageway through life. Verse 25, "Let your eyes look straight ahead and your eyelids look right before you. Ponder the path of your feet and let all your ways be established. Do not turn to the right or the left. Remove your foot from evil." And in the New Testament, Peter writes in his first letter about avoiding this evil path. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2. First Peter chapter 2 and verse 11. "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims." So here we are, we're picking up this link again, this link of pilgrims and pilgrimages. Peter's referring to Christians that are following God's way as pilgrims. "Beloved, I beg you as sojourners and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, which war against the soul. And verse 12, having your conduct honourable among the Gentiles, that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may, by your good works, which they observe, glorify God in the day of visitation. So Peter writes about good works being observed by people, the good works that we do. And that leads me on to the third point that I got from this TV series. So we've looked at following the way, we've looked at the way being confined and narrow, but the third point that came out of that programme that I picked up on was that pilgrims can't hide. One of the comments made during that programme was that there's no hiding place for pilgrims on a pilgrimage. They were travelling in the company of others. Very rarely did they travel alone. It was too unsafe. And in a group, you're more likely to keep on the right track. And as they journeyed, everyone who saw them recognised them as strangers and knew what they were doing. Why? Because people didn't travel around so much in those days. Back in the Middle Ages and before then, when a lot of these pilgrimages or the historical long-distance pilgrimage were taking place, people lived and died within 10 miles, 12 miles of where they were born most of the time. Often they didn't see people from a different county. That's why we've got all these different dialects and accents around the country, and they've been watered down over the years because of mass communication. But if you go back to the Middle Ages and before, I'm sure people from different villages almost, certainly different towns, have very slightly different accents or dialects, and people say, oh, I know exactly where they come from. But if they came from too far away, as these pilgrims were they're travelling through, they'd be saying, they're not local, they're not one of us, can hardly understand what they're saying. So they were known and they were seen. They couldn't hide. They couldn't hide from the group they were with because they were travelling together, and they couldn't hide from the people that lived along the ways that saw them go past. And we can't hide either. We are to be known for who we are. In John chapter 13, John chapter 13 and verse 34, a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I loved you, that you also love one another. Why? Why are we to do all this? By this, all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love one for another. Not just a few, but all will know. Obviously, taken in context, that's all who would see them, but we are supposed to be seen. And I think that people who know us and see us in our interactions with each other hopefully can see that. In Matthew 5, turning back into the Sermon on the Mount again, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14, Matthew chapter 5, verse 14 through 16. Verse 14, you are a light of the world, a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Just like these pilgrims walking on their journey, they were seen. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your God in heaven, or your Father in heaven. Sometimes we might not realise the effect that we have on other people when we do that. I think I've told you this story before, but I'll tell it again. I quite like it, actually. But many years ago I was going to work, and we used to have a car share scheme. So, you know, I'd drive a couple of friends or colleagues one day, and then one of the others would take us to the next day, and we rotate around. And it worked quite well, because sometimes you know how these car shares, I mean, this is going off the tangent a bit, but some of these car share deals don't work because people turn up late or whatever. But the agreement was, if people weren't there, we just left without them. And it worked. If you knew if you weren't going to be at a certain point to link up, then you just went straight into work and nobody bothered. And there was no argument about it's my turn, your turn. It's a good bunch of people. So anyway, I had 2 passengers one day driving into work, just getting out of the 30-mile-an-hour limit, heading off down a country lane, and this car came right out in front of us. And I had to go on the wrong side of the road. I jammed on all the brakes, just hit the curb, I think, but avoided an accident. The car sort of slowed down, saw that, he hadn't caused any trouble, and drove off. And I got in gear again and followed him. And the guy sitting next to me, he looked across, he says, Steve, you're not normal. I said, why? He said, well, a normal person would have that window down, shaking their fist, telling him what to do, flashing their lights, hooting their horn. I said, what good would that do? That's the way I drove. Didn't strike me as odd, but struck them as odd. Now, I'm not saying that to glorify myself at all, because I've heard some of you, and some quite recently, tell me of similar incidents where people have noted how they've behaved or what they've done and have commented on it. Now, often we don't get the comments, but the impression is there. The impression is made that we are different if we follow God's way. Now, that's really comforting, isn't it? It's encouraging when those things happen, and especially so when you get that feedback. But there was another point. The next point I got out of this TV series wasn't quite so encouraging, because it did point out that going on a pilgrimage was not easy. It wasn't easy in the past to make a pilgrimage. People had to commit to it and stick with it. Travel in those days was slow and dangerous. They had the weather to contend with. I mean, the extremes of weather we've had recently. It's lovely going on a walk on a good day. I've done some good walks recently. I made a bad decision one week though, about 4 weeks ago. They forecast very slight drizzle. So off I went, thinking, this is all right. I got to the furthest point away from where I was, and sure enough, the drizzle came. So I sort of turned back, and by the time I got about half a mile back to where I was going, I had several miles to do, it was chucking it down. I was absolutely soaked when I got back. Well, in those days, you couldn't just go home and dry off like I did. You were on a journey. You were going somewhere. You couldn't stop. You had to make the next halt. And, that's the weather. But then there was rough terrain to contend with. Some of these country paths I go down, you think, well, this is a bit of a steep embankment. There was one I went down about 3 weeks ago. And I think I was the first one down this escarpment, because I went with this walking group that time. And I think I was the first one down, and I think I'm probably the youngest in the group. The second one down was a 91-year-old woman, and I'm amazed at how she manages on these walks, but she's always up for a good walk. And we were climbing up banks and all sorts of stuff. And you think, well, this is hard going, but I could imagine her, this 91-year-old, sort of going on one of these long pilgrimages, and all the other people falling out, and she'd still be going. But pilgrims suffered. These journeys they took many days, if not weeks, or sometimes months. And the comment I picked up from the TV series is, talking about these similarities, they said pilgrimages are like life. They're difficult and tiring at times. And don't we feel like that sometimes? We are told that we will suffer because of the way we follow. Like Christ, our suffering can come from people rather than just the terrain or the weather, just physical hazards. Let's turn back to the book of Peter, 1 Peter chapter 2 again. 1 Peter chapter 2, and picking up this time in verse 18. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it, if when you are beaten for your faults, that you take it patiently? Well, we deserve it when we get beaten for our faults, as it were. But when you do good and suffer for it, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that way that I was talking about earlier, that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was guile found in his mouth, who, when he was reviled, did not revile in return. When he suffered, he didn't threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live for righteousness, by whose stripes you were healed. For you were all like sheep going astray, which we were before we were called, but now return to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. And if we just turn on to chapter 4, again near where we were before, chapter 4, and in verse 12. Beloved, do not think it strange concerning the fiery trial which is to try you, as though some strange thing happened to you. But rejoice to the extent that you partake of Christ's sufferings, that when his glory is revealed, you may also be glad with exceeding joy. If you are reproached for the name of Christ, blessed are you. For the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. So we're told that there will be persecution. We're told that that there will be suffering. Our pilgrimage isn't guaranteed to be easy. Pilgrimages aren't always easy. We won't turn there, but again in Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5 verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake. But it's for righteousness' sake. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Following Christ's example, following his way, isn't easy, but it is worthwhile. So, if you're counting, that's 4 points we've covered. The fifth point, which I thought was, again, very appropriate similarity between a long walking pilgrimage and our pilgrimage through life, is that there were stops on the way. There were distinct stops on these pilgrim routes to these particular places they were going to. They stopped along the route they took. They could refresh themselves there for the next leg of the journey. And I guess it was the legs that needed refreshing. That was a joke, by the way. You know, next leg of the journey, legs need refreshing on the walk. These places were known as pilgrims' rests, and they were considered important to the pilgrim. One example on the programme, from the north of England to Canterbury, for example, there were two main, really big rest points on the route. One was at Lincoln and one was at London. And there they would meet with other pilgrims. Maybe, they'd catch up with people who were resting there before their next part of the journey. They would encourage each other on their journey to continue. And We'll probably get the analogy before I'm explaining it. And one of the features of these places were pilgrims from all sorts of backgrounds in life would mix together on an equal basis. The TV programme commented that pilgrimages attracted people from all walks of life. And it said it was where a knight and a ploughman could mix together equally. Now, I don't know if we've got many knights here, and I don't think we've got many ploughmen here. But you get the gist of it. All walks of life. And isn't that us in the church? We've all got different professions, different talents, different skills. Some are musical, some aren't. Some have got different interests outside the church, but we've all got that common interest in following the way, in the goal that is ahead of us. But we're together, sharing the journey and resting together. Where do we rest together? Well, our resting points on a spiritual basis, like today, when we meet together. We're having a rest, if you like, before we tackle another week of our normal activities, getting together, sharing things together, refocusing on our journey and encouraging each other on the way. If we turn to Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10 and in verse 25. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together, as is the manner of some. Without those pilgrims getting together at those rest points and encouraging each other and getting refreshed for their next leg, they probably wouldn't have completed their journey. And isn't that the same with us? You know, I miss it if I don't get that weekly fellowship with others of like mind and being here, or as we were last week in Birmingham, or the week before that in Exeter. Not forsaking the assembling of ourselves together as the manner of some is, but exhorting one another. And so much more as you see the day approaching. And the day's approaching for all of us. I mean, like those pilgrims, if you like, the closer they got, the end result was approaching them, or they were approaching the end result. And it's the same with us. A lot of us have been on a pilgrimage through life. We were just talking before services. And 40 years the children of Israel took to get to the promised land. A lot of us have been in our pilgrimage with God on our right course of life for about that length of time, some longer, some a lot shorter. But it's approaching for all of us. And what do? We assemble together for services, and then we fellowship with each other afterwards. It allows us the time to do what it says in the verse above. And let us consider one another. And again, different translations and looking in dictionaries, to consider one another. We can read it quite quickly, but what does it really mean? To think about carefully or thoughtfully. So it's not just the first thing that comes into our head or whatever, but in order to encourage others to stir up love and good works, think about it carefully. And I know it happens. I overhear conversations sometimes. I've been involved in them where people are really concerned about helping others. What can we do for each other? And that is the encouragement we need on our little rests as we go through this journey to make the next leg and to continue to the end. And continuing to the end was another point that came out of that TV series. Point 6. A pilgrim needs endurance, because a pilgrimage takes time. They need to persevere patiently, just keep going on that journey. Just turning forward from Hebrews, just one book, to the book of James. James chapter 5 and in verse 7. Therefore be patient, brethren, until the coming of the Lord. See how the farmer waits for the precious fruit of the earth, waiting patiently for it until it receives the early and latter rain. Now a farmer has to be patient, isn't it? You can't rush it. You've probably heard examples like I've heard of little children who have been encouraged to do a bit of gardening. You know, they put a seed in the ground or whatever, or a little plant, and as soon as something pops up out the ground, they whip it up to see what's underneath it. Like if it was a carrot or whatever, they whip it out and there's nothing there. They haven't been patient. They've got to learn patience. It takes time. It's not instant. You just don't, it's not like instant coffee or whatever. You just don't put it in the ground, water it, and there it is. A farmer has to wait patiently. You also be patient, it says in verse 8. Establish your hearts for what? For the coming of the Lord is at hand. Do not grumble against one another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge is standing at the door. My brethren, take the prophets who spoke in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering and patience. And as we read about the prophets, we can think of some of the things they went through and the suffering they had. But they were patient. Indeed, we count them blessed who endure. You have heard of the perseverance of Job and seen the end intended by the Lord, and that the Lord is very compassionate and merciful. And the story of Job is a very encouraging one. And Paul, writing in Galatians, also shows that we should keep continuing in the right direction. Galatians 6 verse 9. Galatians 6 verse 9. And let us not grow weary while doing good. To keep on that journey, it's no good getting weary, you'd give up. Let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Now, one way of helping that endurance, that keeping going, is to stay focused and to keep our minds on the goal. And that's the seventh point that came out of the programme that I watched, that I thought, yes, there's lots of similarities here. Pilgrimages had a final destination, and the pilgrims knew that. They knew where they were going, and they just kept that destination in mind. Whether we're heading for Canterbury, Rome, or Jerusalem, they kept that focused in their mind. How, you know, the exhilaration of just getting there, of achieving that goal. And we need to stay focused on our goal and keep our minds focused on the end of that the end destination that we're heading for. We pray, don't we? If not daily, very, very often, your kingdom come. We should say that from our hearts and our minds and never ever get distracted from that destination. Your kingdom come. Sir Edmund Hillary, that famous climber of Mount Everest, said, and again another sort of analogy here, life is a bit like mountaineering, he said. Never look down. The only way he made it to the top was never looking down. Just keeping his mind, his eyes, goal on that end destination, the peak of the mountain. And our journey is similar, just like that. Climbing a mountain. Never look away from the goal. Never look away from where we're going. And remember, it's the same goal that men and women of God have always had. Abraham had it. Hebrews 11. Hebrews 11 verse 9. Referring to Abraham here, by faith he sojourned. And sojourning is another name for a pilgrimage. Some of a stranger, a pilgrim, sojourner, they're all sort of the same connotation. By faith he sojourned in the land of promise, as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of that same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Some other translations have, Abraham lived as an alien, a foreigner, a stranger. And on this verse, the Jameson Fawcett Brown Bible commentary notes, sojourned as a stranger and pilgrim. So we've got that connotation all the time, that connection with pilgrimages. And in verse 13, these all died in faith, all the people mentioned earlier in the chapter, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off. They kept them in mind, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. That's us, isn't it? Pilgrims on the earth, making a pilgrimage. But our destination is not an earthly city such as Canterbury or Rome or even Jerusalem. Not the current one anyway. Our destination is the city built by God. Now I've given you 7 similarities between long walking pilgrimages and our pilgrimage through life. But you know, there's one big difference between the destinations of pilgrims shown in that TV series and our destination at the end of our pilgrimage. Do you know what it is? Well, when they reached their destination, they might have spent a few days there, then they went home. They went back where they came from. But not us. Let's continue in verse 11, because that city of God, where we will be at home. In verse 14, for those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. We're not looking for a temporary destination. We're not going on holiday and coming back. We're looking for a city, the city of God, a homeland. And truly, if they'd been called to mind, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. Do we want to go back? Verse 16, but now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So we've seen that God does call us as pilgrims, and he does want us to go on a pilgrimage. And we are on a pilgrimage. Our lives are individual pilgrimages. Our physical pilgrimages are unlikely to be as long as Jacob's or some of the other characters in the Old Testament. But remember the goal of our pilgrimage. And I thought it tied in quite well with that second definition I gave you at the beginning, where it said we are headed to a holy place, or a special place, or an unusual place, because our destination is a really holy place. The end of the Bible reveals something so much more than a man-made city that contains old relics. In the book of Revelation, there is a vision of a very different city. And this is the destination of our pilgrimage. Revelation 21, verse 2. Revelation 21, verse 2. Then I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from heaven saying, behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. And God will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There shall be no more death, nor sorrow, nor crying, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things have passed away. Now that to me is a very special place, a very unusual place. And in chapter 22 verse 1, and he showed me a pure river of water of life, clear as crystal, proceeding from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street and on either side of the river was the tree of life, which bore 12 fruits, each tree yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. And there shall be no more curse, but the throne of God and of the Lamb shall be in it, and his servants shall serve him. They shall see his face, and his name shall be on their foreheads. And there shall be no night there. They need no lamp nor light of the sun, for the Lord God gives them light, and they shall reign for ever and ever. Yes, our pilgrimage is a lifelong journey. Our destination is to a sacred place, God's holy city.